super stimuli. It really draws our attention even faster. And if the eyes especially are disproportionate, it suggests youth. It suggests something that's young, and these sort of care emotions get triggered really fast because it's super stimuli. Hi, I'm Justin Barrett. I'm president of Blueprint 1543. I'm a psychological scientist and former university professor. And in this episode, I'm continuing my discussion of curbing our tech enthusiasm, trying to identify what are those technologies that can sort of take on a monstrous life of their own and wreak havoc all over the place, quite unintentionally. How do we identify those so that we can kind of get out in front of them, adjust our attitudes, and maybe be a little bit more cautious about broadly releasing them onto the world? Okay, that's what we're doing. I first introduced the idea of the non-inevitability of technologies, that really no technology is inevitable. So we need to think about how can we put up appropriate resistance to some technologies being kind of put into our lives. How do we resist adopting them? Second, we especially want to pay attention. In the second episode I talked about, we especially want to pay attention to those technologies that are a little bit like Kudzu, that they spread broadly and deeply and cause new problems. But because they spread so fast, they're really hard to eradicate, to pull out of our lives. Or think of them a little bit like you can't put the genie back in the bottle, that kind of technology. Those especially are the ones we want to be able to anticipate so that we can figure out, okay, well, what do we do about it before it's too late? And I very briefly sketched 4 questions that I think are helpful in thinking about which of those technologies are more likely to take on that characteristic, that they will spread broadly and root themselves deeply in our lives so that they become very hard to extract. This has been on my mind lately because, I've got some of these invasive vining plants in my own yard back here that I'm fighting all the time. It's a lot of hard work and it feels like a forever losing battle. So it's better if we never have to fight that fight because we didn't let them take root in the first place. Right? So I had suggested 4 questions. There are 4 questions that arise out of the cognitive science of culture. That is the study of how our minds adopt certain kinds of cultural forms and are receptive to different forms of culture. So I want to run through those 4 much more slowly now so that you get a better feel for what they mean so that you can start applying them in your own life and you can think about different technologies. And then I'm going to give lots of examples, not in this episode. I'll give one example in this episode. And then in subsequent episodes, I'll work out the questions on more examples, on more technologies that you probably think might be a little bit scary, the kind of thing that could cause real trouble, disruptions.
You have to let it all go, Neo. Fear, doubt, and disbelief. Free your mind.
Whoa. So the 4 questions. The first one is it easy to use? I had talked about in a previous episode that one indicator of maybe a good technology is that it's actually a little bit hard to learn how to use it. Why? Don't we want our technologies to be easy? Well, no, we want our technologies to bring out the best in us. We want our technologies to improve us, not just improve our lives, meaning making our lives easy. We want them to improve our lives because they improve our character. They give us new strengths. And to do that, we need to have to learn a little something, acquire a new skill, acquire some expertise. Tools that do that in some ways are overall better than ones that are just super easy. If a 2 or 3-year-old can figure it out in 15 minutes by just fooling around with it, it's probably too easy a technology, unless, of course, it's just for them to do just that. But for adults, it's probably not the kind of technology you want. It's too easy. What's going to make it too easy? Well, that whoever has engineered it has worked really hard to make it completely transparently intuitive to the way our minds work. You might think, well, whose mind? But if you've been watching my channel a little bit, you know that in my area of psychological science and the kind of cognitive science of culture that I draw upon and have written a lot about, we're actually of the camp that there are certain ways of thinking that are much more natural or intuitive to pretty much anybody's mind than others. A really easy example is fear of snakes. We readily form fears of snakes.
I get it. There's a snake in my boot.
Just by virtue of being human beings. Other species will do it too, even if it turns out the snake isn't dangerous. Okay, and this is a really well-known type of psychological phenomena. Another example is we find it very easy to form an aversion or an avoidance of a food that we've eaten, and then we get sick afterwards, even if the food didn't make us sick. So I sometimes call this the cheeseburger phenomenon because when I was a kid, we were on a family road trip, stopped at a restaurant, I ate a cheeseburger, I got car sick. I didn't want to even think about cheeseburgers for about 10 years after that. I really didn't. But that's a natural thing to have that strong aversions. So that kind of thinking, that kind of joining up certain things is just natural to us. Well, it turns out there are lots of those examples out there. There are some things that are easier for us to think than others. And some of us working in this area in developmental psychology and cognitive science will sometimes refer to these as intuitive. These are intuitive ways of thinking. So we mean it in that kind of technical sense. Well, certain technologies take advantage of our intuitive ways of thinking, our intuitive ways of acting, and our intuitive ways of learning, such that they're really easy. And in general, that's a good-ish thing. But that's one of the things we want to pay attention to. Is it fully intuitive to use? Or does it take a little bit of special learning on top of it being relatively easy? So actually using even tool like, say, a chainsaw, which is not super complex, it's not fully intuitive. There's some steps you've got to learn that are not just sort of built into the way we naturally think, and so forth. There are lots of examples of this. So is it easy because it's really intuitive? Second, are we motivated to use it because we've got natural drives or motivations that this tool helps us sort of realize or takes the place of even? Those basic human drives like need for security, for protection, for temperature regulation, for getting enough nutrition, for getting enough water, for having good relationships with other people, for feeling socially bonded in a group, for feeling agency or efficacy, ability to do stuff. Those basic drives that some people will recognize from different kinds of motivational pyramids in psychology, like Maslow's hierarchy and so forth. Those are the kinds of things that if a technology is sort of slotted in to solve one of those problems, it's an attractive technology to us because it's helping us address real world, perennial human problems. So good thing for this technology because we're going to be very attracted to it. Where I start getting a little nervous is if we're motivated to think about this technology or use it because it's taking the place of the natural way we would do that. One of the clearest examples is social media taking the place of regular social interactions. Okay, we've got a basic human drive for acceptance, for having relatedness, for connecting with people. Well, what's the right way to do that? Well, it's face-to-face. So you might think that social media is kind of taking the place of genuine interpersonal face-to-face relationships. But we'll talk about social media in a separate episode. But just give you an idea of what I mean by that motivation. So is it easy was the first question. Intuitive. It's easy because it's easy to use because it's intuitive. Second, is it tapping into or playing off of basic human motivations? Third, is it attention grabbing? And we might go 3A and B, two subtypes of being attention grabbing, because there's sort of two ways to be really attention grabbing. One is actually to be slightly counterintuitive. So to take our intuitive ways of thinking and just tweak it just a little bit. And I'll give an example of that in just a second. The second way of being attention grabbing is by taking our usual intuitions and amping them up to become what is sometimes called super stimuli, to sort of take the ordinary and make it extraordinary. An example of that is the way that comic books and other kinds of illustrations sometimes exaggerate, for instance, the distinctive or the characteristic features of maleness versus femaleness in humans. We are going to hypersexualize males and females by making the males even more male and the females even more female than would normally be the case. Well, that's called superstimuli, and it really grabs our attention. Another way to do that that we see in cartooning is to take human faces, but make the eyes really big. Why? Because our face detection system pays a lot of attention to eyes and mouths. If you exaggerate eyes and mouths, it makes that cognitive system in our brains go, whoa, I see a face. It's super stimuli. It really draws our attention even faster. And if the eyes especially are disproportionate, it suggests youth. It suggests something that's young, and these sort of care emotions get triggered really fast because it's super stimuli.
Oh, come on, donkey. Look at him in his wee little boots.
So we can grab attention by something being super stimuli, or we can grab attention by being a little bit counterintuitive. What I mean by a little bit counterintuitive is something like this. And this will be an example that I'm going to develop a little more, is the microwave oven. Okay, a microwave oven, cool technology that spread really quickly. In the early 80s, it started being introduced into houses, and it had explosive spread. And now I think most of us can't imagine life without the microwave. So microwave is kind of a pretty good candidate for one of these kudzu-like things. Not perfect, but it's a pretty strong candidate. It started at basically ground zero, and spread rapidly within 1 decade. It was all over the place in most of the Western world. Well, one of the things that the microwave has going for it is easy to use. I'll come back to that. Second, we're motivated to use it because it's helping us do a basic human need, prepare food. We've been doing this for eons. We've been preparing our foods. We cook foods. But it was attention grabbing. For those of us old enough to remember the introduction of the microwave, it was really kind of magical, not just because of its speed, but that was important, but because it heated food without adding heat. So a typical, natural, intuitive way to cook something is to add heat to it, right? Flames, you got to cook over flames. Well, the air around a flame is hot. You put the object that you want to heat next to that hot air, and then it becomes hot. That's a very intuitive kind of way of heating things. The microwave is magical because the air in the microwave isn't hot. You don't burn yourself by touching the microwave, but the food gets hot anyway. It's like, whoa, this is so counterintuitive that it grabs our attention, right? That tweak in something that's otherwise very natural. So you can grab attention by being super stimuli, like in comic books or animations, or you can grab attention because you're slightly counterintuitive, like the microwave. And then my fourth question is, even if a technology isn't all that intuitive or isn't piggybacking off of those deep-seated psychological motivations, or isn't attention grabbing in quite those ways, is it piggybacking on another technology or another cultural form that already has become a sort of a super spreader, is all over the place, and is going nowhere fast? And you might say that the microwave oven is an example of this too, because it's sort of taking the place of a learned slot in our minds for ovens, right? So microwave oven, it looks a little bit like a tiny oven. The way of, at least originally, the controls mimicked an oven that people already knew how to use, that had already spread successfully. And so the older oven sort of helped the spread of the acquisition and spread of the microwave oven. And you might think that a lot of our digital technological devices, such as text messaging over our phones, piggybacks on what technology? Well, text, writing, literacy. Literacy is a widespread technology. It's actually hard to learn, but our societies have already invested so deeply in people learning how to write that it's there as a background. Now, interestingly, I think texting is also becoming less literate as we go, because the more we use emoticons and other kinds of things, we're actually moving back to something a little bit more like hieroglyphics, away from a true written language, back to something that's much more symbolic and actually more intuitive. It's easier. Those are the 4 questions. I hope that going through them a little bit slower makes them make a little more sense. And in subsequent episodes of these videos, I'm going to work through some examples that you might find interesting to think through, like social media, but especially we're going to get to artificial intelligence of various sorts. So come back, keep following me if you are interested in how I think about those using this framework for identifying those broad and fast spreading kinds of technologies that root themselves so deeply in our lives that they're going to be hard to extract. And so if they become problematic, we're all in trouble. So how can we be more tech prudent so we can get out in front of those and have a good, healthy relationship with technologies instead of feeling like we're a victim of their whims and their rage? Until next time, try to be tech prudent, like, subscribe, share. Thanks for joining me.